Hi, this is Brendan from SSW, and this is a video about server-side validation in SugarLearning. I'm going to start by showing you the SSW rules. This is from Rules to Better Web API, and the rule is, do you use fluent validation? And the point here is that a lot of client-side apps, modern JavaScript apps, will give you these tools to validate on the client side, but those features are really for usability. They're not for data safety. They don't really protect the server from data coming in. So the argument here is just always use good server-side validation on the server side and have a way of dealing with those server-side errors when they're raised. So what we're going to do is to talk you through how we're using fluent validation to validate server-side, how we're also integrating with errors that get raised right from the very depths of the system, how we're surfacing them into the system and actually getting those integrated with the client-side errors. So our goal here is to have a very simple way of having client-side and server-side errors render in a common way. So let's start with the server side. And in my previous video, I talked about how we're moving towards CQRS within the SugarLearning system. And one of the great benefits of that CQRS is the single responsibility principle and having a view model that's specific for a task. When it comes to editing items, we have the edit item model. And here it is, a very clean definition of all the fields we need to be working with when we're dealing with editing items within the SugarLearning application. And then right next to that model, we've got this thing called the edit item model validator. And because we're using fluent validation, we can use these really cool fluent syntax to actually attach the validation behaviors to a model without having to modify the model itself. So we've got a model defined, we've got a model validation defined, now to go about actually applying those validations. And what we've got in this application layer is this infrastructure folder. And here is something called request validation behavior. So what this does is it intercepts all handlers raised by mediator, and if it finds a validator for the view model being fed in, it will then run that validation on that view model and throw an exception when that validation fails. And that validation is of data exception. So straight away, if there's validation to be run on any of our incoming requests or commands, more importantly commands, then we'll automatically run the fluent validation on it and throw an exception. And then the exception we throw here is our own class data exception. So let's take a look at that. And so what we return to the clients when we have an exception is basically a list of validation errors keyed by name. And we've made our own specific type for this, which has a read-only dictionary of string, which maps our path or name of the field that has a problem, and then an array of all the errors for that field. So a very simple structure. And there's one very important reason we're building our own structure here and not just using the standard fluent validation error format. And that's we actually have some more errors that can be raised from the system. And that is these class member exception base. Let's take a look at this. So right deep in the system, very deep in the logic classes and very deep in the repository layer, some of the functions will throw a class that extends this class member exception base. You see this class member exception base has an error message, but it also has a member name string. So if there are problems found deep in the repository layer, for example, we're trying to create a duplicate record name, this can throw these exceptions, and with this common data exception error type here, that means that errors that are thrown from the fluent validation, but also errors that are flowing from much deeper in the system in those very custom repositories we have, they can all actually be pushed into this one data shape to be sent as server-side errors down to the client. And if we look a level up, we do have in our web layer, we have this API exception filter. So this is an exception filter wired into all the API exceptions, and will catch some of these exceptions. So it will catch the class member exception base, or it will catch the data exception. And in both those cases, we handle that response slightly differently. So in both those cases, we turn this response into HTTP status code 422. And then for the body of that response, we return the JSON rendering of that errors by name collection. So that's a dictionary of name or field to then a list of error messages. So what we've done is we've forced both these error types, our validation exceptions and our class member exceptions thrown from deep in the system, to have a common error shape that we then return with this 422 status code. And let me just talk about the 422 status code. HTTP 422 status code actually means unprocessable entity. So quite often it's common to see something like a 400 bad request state, but a lot of the 400 error states for HTTP are really referring to the HTTP transport mechanism itself. So 400 might mean there was something wrong with the request that was sent, or all kinds of things like that. Where 422 is really specifically for that there's nothing wrong with the request itself. Like the HTTP happened fine, we received the data, but then when we processed the data itself, that had a problem. So this is what I tend to prefer using to indicate to the client, you sent me something, there was nothing wrong with how it was sent, but the contents of the data you sent me had a problem, and now you can undo that. So now on the client side, we can specifically catch this 422 status code and know that it's a server-side validation error, and it's one that we can display to the client. Okay, so that's the server side of the story. Let's start talking about the client side. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is really the default Angular story for validation. So here's an example of straight from the Angular documentation. Let me zoom in slightly. You can see here, this is the story given to you for Angular for doing validation. And I've got quite a couple of problems with this story. The first is that you've got all this validation engine, but every single error that you want to display has been rendered specifically into the template. Now, the problem with this is that you need to know, when writing this template, all the different errors that might be raised. So you've got to know that you've set up this form to have a required field, and you've set up this form for this to have a min length. And actually every single error you want to display is explicitly listed here. Now this is a problem if you want to have any kind of server-side errors, because you don't know from the client what errors might be raised. So that's the first problem I have. The second problem is there is no explicit support for server-side errors at all. Everything here is client-side. So there's no capacity given to you to display server-side errors within this Angular form. Let's take a look at how that compares to something we used to have in the MVC days of unobtrusive validation. So if you look at this form, you see we've got an input field, we've then got a whole bunch of fields for a whole bunch of chunks of template just displaying all the different error types. If I look at the MVC story, it's much cleaner. What we used to have is a label, a text box, and then this placeholder for displaying the messages. And we don't care what the message is, we just know in the template, whatever the messages are, display them here. So this is something that we used to have that I preferred working with. It's much cleaner to look at, much cleaner to read. So what we're looking to do here is actually recapture some of this clarity in our new implementation. So let's go ahead now and start looking at what we've got on the client side to deal with this. I'm going to switch to the client-side code. And what you can see here is, unlike the default Angular story, what we've actually got here is a label, an input field, a little bit of a text prompt, and then we've got this single line that we've added called SSW validation message. And this is a custom bit of code we've added to perform that role of the validation message for that you used to see in MVC. So let's take a look at how we implemented that. If we look at the component, there's a few things going on. So here is the form builder for this specific form. And what we've done is we've pulled in this extra library called Angular Reactive Validation. be hard to spot without knowing it's there. So let me point that out again. We've pulled in a library from GitHub that I found. It's not hugely popular, but it's called Angular Reactive Validation. And this library gives you one thing. When you go ahead and build your form group using a form builder, it looks exactly the same as before, but when we say a object is required, we don't just put validators.required, we put validators.required and explicitly feed in, when we're setting up the form, what the error message is. And the same for validators.minLength. So now the error message you want to display is part of the validation definition, not part of the template definition. The next thing we've done is this whole new section here. We've made a custom validator type called SSW validators.server-side. What we feed in is this object, this.server-side errors. So towards the top of the component here, you should see somewhere along the line, we have made this thing called server-side errors, and it's a behavior subject. So what happens here is when we perform that request to the server to save an object, if that request fails with 422, it will populate those errors into this server-side errors object, and we can feed that into our validator to get this custom validator function to render it along with all the client-side. So what we've got here is client-side errors and server-side errors all wired in to the same error handler. And if you want to see more details about how this all works, then come here and find the SSW validators file, which is right here. And basically this implements the function, a validator function, just like the client-side validators are. So we've made our own custom validator function on top of Angular, but instead of this one doing client-side code, this actually looks at the pre-made state of our server-side errors, and if it finds a server-side error, it marks the field as invalid and carries on that way. So let's take a look at how that works. So I'm going to switch to a SugarLearning page, and I've got a test screen open here. And let me clear some of those errors. And so I've got a test edit item here. Now let's see what happens if I come in and clear that. You can see we've got a very quick client-side validation all in place. If I make that too small, we get the minimum length of string. If I make that empty, we're getting title is required. And this still has all those rules around don't show an error until I've touched the form. Let's do something else now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to change this to a title that actually conflicts with a known title that's already been saved. So this is actually module 1. And in module 1, we have a item called first step. And if I come down and hit save now and scroll back up, you can see I've got this error message through. This is already a learning item with the same title in this module. And this particular error isn't a validation error. It's actually come from all the way down in the repository layer, and by bubbling this up, turning it into the right shape, and then binding it in, we're having this display to the user in exactly the same format as the client-side errors. So pretty powerful stuff. So thank you for watching. This was a video about how we've integrated server-side and client-side errors into a common display visibility in SugarLearning, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.